Okay, thank you very much, Munjubay. First of all, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for coming here this evening. Now, I'm actually, as I said, I'm a teacher, so I'm used to wandering around. So if you do find me wandering away from the microphone, I do apologize. I do have quite a loud voice that projects anyway. Okay, so I know the main concern here is YouTube. That's why I have to stay near the microphone, apparently. Okay, so over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be answering the question that you can see on the screen, which is there a Muslim Europe? As Manjubai just said, we live in a non-Muslim country. But hopefully by the end of this session, you're going to realize that being British and being European, we actually have a very long and very rich Islamic heritage. And the way that I'm going to answer these questions is, first of all, I'm going to give you a quick overview of Europe's historic and living indigenous Muslim presence. Now, those of you that might not understand what the word indigenous means, it means people who are from and of the land originally. Okay? And that's something that normally, when you tell people that Europe has indigenous Muslims, they tend to frown because they believe there is no such thing as through and through European Muslims. Hopefully by the end of this session, you'll see that that is absolute nonsense. And I'm going to use my own work to remind you of this living indigenous European Muslim culture. And then I'm going to show you a glimpse of an overlooked and very rich British Muslim heritage. Are we okay with the microphone? You need me to? Okay. So, the first picture on your screen that you see is in Cyprus, which might surprise a few of you. It is known as the Hala Sultan Teki. Reportedly, this is the bit that's going to shock you if Monjubai gets out of the way, because people are trying to actually see this. This timing is really bad, isn't it? Okay, reportedly, the final resting place of a woman known as Haram, who was quite possibly a maternal aunt of none other than the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Hence, Hala, which comes from the word Hala. Most of us in Bangladeshi, we have Khalas. It's usually on your mother's side. That's where the name comes from. That's why it's called Hala Sultan Teki. She died in Cyprus, which is part of Europe, as you all know, in 649. That means the very first generation of Muslims were in Europe. In fact, some believe the great Khalifa Abu Bakr also made it onto Cyprus as well. So what does this tell us? It tells us that Muslim Europe is 14 centuries old. As old as Islam itself. Now, the second picture might be a bit more familiar to some of you, especially those of you that have traveled. I can see some of my friends in the audience who have been to these places. This, of course, is an image of the Alhambra. And the Alhambra evokes the most glorious Muslim history of Europe in what was known as Al-Andalus, the region we today know as Spain and Portugal, where from 711 to 1492, do the maths, it's over 800 years, nearly 800 years, where a cultured and flourishing Abrahamic civilization, that means Muslims, Jews, and Christians all lived together and achieved unbelievable things for the time. It was one of the most tolerant societies across the entire European continent, and it was led by the Islamic faith, the pinnacle of which was in 929 AD. So some of you will have seen at the beginning that glorious mihrab, which is from the Mezquita Cathedral in Cordoba. And in that Mezquita Cathedral, when it was a mosque, in 929 AD, Abdurrahman III declared himself Khalif. We had European Khalifa. And I doubt many of you would have known that before you walked into this session today. So 7 centuries of indigenous Muslim Europe can be found in that peninsula. But the thing about history is, it's easy to dismiss. People can just say, well, that's history. You know, Muslims were here, but you're not here anymore. And that's where my book comes in. You see, in order to write my book, I did a journey through a living Muslim Europe. And as you can see, from the sentence underlined, which I will read for all of those over there who can't see the screen. Europe has long turned a blind eye, or worse, looked askance at its own Islamic self. In other words, Europe has never really been comfortable with the Muslimness within it. And that's what this journey was about, which I'm going to take you on now. I'm going to take you on a quick snapshot of the journey that I took as part of the book that is over there. And it was to explore this living indigenous Muslim Europe. In other words, Muslims who are through and through European. They've never been nothing else. And for each stop and each image that I take you to, I'm going to be showing you a little bit about what I discovered on this journey, which in itself is quite depressing, really, given that, you know, I'm a European and I actually go out my way to study these things. And even I didn't know half of what I found out there. Now, it was actually a road trip that I took with my family. 6 weeks, 4 of us in a tiny car, which sounds like a recipe for a disaster, and in many ways it was. But we won't go into that right now. I left that bit out of the book. And for 6 weeks during the summer, we traveled through 6 countries. Now, these countries were chosen deliberately. Hands up if you think Europe has Muslim countries. Where do you think are Muslim countries? Fantastic. Any others? Turkey? They don't even consider that Europe, I'm afraid. But good shout, because a bit of it is. A bit of it is. This side of Istanbul, apparently. Yes. Kosovo. Fantastic. Now, why is it that when you talk to people, though, and you say Europe has Muslim countries, they look at you like you've completely lost the plot? And yet, of course, as this young gentleman here and the gentleman over there rightly identified, Europe has at least 3 quote-unquote Muslim countries. What I mean by that is they're over 50% of the population profess to Islam. Now, I did say at the beginning I was a teacher. Now, you know how teachers can embarrass people who talk, right? Gentlemen, please. I should teach Monjubai about this. The way teachers get people to be quiet is actually shut up themselves. Suddenly the people talking realize nobody's talking. Okay, I know you want to chat and everything, but it's really distracting for me, okay? Let's try and keep that stum. So 6 countries. We started off in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which of course is a Muslim country. We actually started off in a Muslim city, Sarajevo, which was founded by the Ottomans. And then we went through Serbia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Albania, and Montenegro, all of which have at least 6 centuries of Islamic heritage across these countries. And as I said to you, 3 of them have a Muslim majority population. Bosnia and Herzegovina has over 50%, Albania has over 70%, and Kosovo over 90%. That's more than some other countries across the world that we consider to be Muslim. And yet, like I say, if you were to say to somebody, oh, you know, I visited a Muslim country in Europe, they'd consider that to be an oxymoron. You can Google that later. Now, as part of this journey, I took with me a guide. You'll notice in the top right-hand corner of the map, a gentleman on horseback wearing a turban. His name is Evliya Çelebi. Now, Evliya Çelebi is a 17th century Ottoman traveler who traveled through these lands as well, and he wrote about it. And the reason I took Evliya Çelebi with me is because Evliya Çelebi was traveling when the Ottomans were at their absolute zenith, the height of their power. In other words, Evliya Çelebi was traveling through here when it was the most Muslim it had ever been. And he offered a tantalizing glimpse of what had been deliberately eradicated. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that's been done shortly. But before I do, given that Evliya Çelebi was such an amazing guide for me, I should tell you a little bit about him. So in the name Evliya, you may have heard the word Awliya. And so Evliya Çelebi considered himself, well, he was part of a great Sufi lineage, and he was considering himself a friend of God. That's what Awliya means. And his father was actually the goldsmith to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. So he came from pretty impressive stock. In fact, his father built the golden spout that you see coming out of the top of the Kaaba. So this is some seriously impressive heritage right here. And this is the gentleman that I followed in his footsteps. So I'm going to take you first to this beautiful bridge in Mosque. And the reason I came to this bridge, there were a number of reasons. It was also one of the first bridges, it was one of the first places where I realized the depth of the historic Islamophobia towards the Muslim culture of the region. And what I mean by that is this. The Starry Mosque, as it is popularly known, was built in the 16th century by a student of Mimar Sinan. Many people think it's Mimar Sinan. Mimar Sinan is the greatest Ottoman architect to have ever lived. And Khairuddin, his student, is who built this. It was commissioned by none other than Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, probably the greatest Ottoman sultan that ever lived. Someone who was respected across the globe, not just by Muslims. And yet, in spite of the evidence that this was a beautiful bridge built by the Ottomans, this is what a famous English archaeologist, as recently as 1897, said, Sir Arthur Evans. These are the people, by the way, whose books all the people who now teach us read, so you can think about that. This is what Sir Arthur Evans said. He believed it had to be Roman. He believed something so beautiful could not possibly be built by Muslims. And the painter, Charlotte de Lezen, when she came through it, she said, and I quote, "It is a marvelous remnant of Latin civilization in the midst of Turkish barbarity." So again, attributing it to Romans and saying that the Turks, the Muslims, were simply too barbaric to build something so beautiful. The other reason I went to this bridge was because it was one of the first places that I really connected with Evliya Çelebi, who also visited the bridge during his travels. But it's also a bridge that, of course, is a very, very powerful symbol. What you're looking at is not the original bridge. The original bridge was destroyed in the 1990s Balkans War in what was known by many and one particular Harvard observer as cultural genocide. It was, of course, a real genocide, for those of you that know about these things. But this was also going on, trying to eradicate the actual identity of the Muslim community in these places. And then, brick by brick, it was rebuilt because of the efforts of some very, very empowered local people, including one particular gentleman called Amir Pasic, who just simply refused to accept that it had been destroyed. And he went on a lengthy campaign, raised loads of money, got the likes of Turkey to support him, and eventually the UN as well. And they rebuilt it brick by brick using Ottoman experts on Ottoman architecture. So after this, very close by to the south, I went to a place called Blagaj Teki. Now this Teki in the south is probably one of the most beautiful little monuments I've been to, and I knew nothing about it before I arrived. And again, Evliya Çelebi led me there, because Evliya Çelebi visited this place way back in the 17th century. It goes all the way back to the 16th century and is still a functioning Sufi lodge even to this day. And it was originally founded by a sect called the Bektashis. Today, it's in the custody of the Naqshbandis. But these are all elements of Islamic heritage that we know almost nothing about. And the Bektashis are quite dominant across Europe because of the Ottomans, who introduced them through their Janissary corps. But it was also a place where, again, I felt like I connected with Evliya on a very intimate level. Because Çelebi arrived here shortly after losing his father, who was one of his great spiritual guides, and losing his great patron, Melik Pasha, who was the person that supported him to travel around. And so it was amazing to enter a space and actually feel that I was in the same place as someone as great as the Ottoman traveler. Now, what I put in front of you is an image of a librarian in what is quite an obscure, quote unquote, obscure place in the middle of Bosnia. Now, even people who have been to Bosnia tend to visit these three places, Sarajevo, Mostar, and Blagaj. Very few people know anything about Zenica, which is in the center of the country. And I was only led there because my Bosnian friend is from there. And he said to me, "You must come and visit my madrasa from when I was a young boy." And then next to it was this library. And then this guy goes over to these dusty books. He pulls open a book, and it is over 600 years old book of fiqh that combines Hanafi and Shafi'i fiqh. Just there on the shelf. No gloves, no glass cabinets. And it blew me away. The book is actually older than Sarajevo. It blew me away because I realized how many of these gems, these treasures, these pieces of our heritage as Muslims of Europe now, were sitting on dusty shelves, either being ignored or potentially being destroyed. And how many had been destroyed during that cultural genocide? The gentleman himself is like a Ottoman relic because his name is Ibrahim Babic Effendi, which is of course an Ottoman title as well. Now, I'm going to pick on somebody again. What do you think you're looking at here? A dome, very good. What about the patterns? What kind of dome are we looking at? Anyone who follows me knows what this is. You can see nobody clearly follows me in here. So what you're looking at probably looks like it belongs in Florence, maybe even Rome. And yet, it's a mosque in North Macedonia. And you're looking at a beautiful art style that was developed by the Ottomans during the 18th century, known as the Tulip art style, where they combined classical Baroque Rococo, in other words, classical European art with classical Islamic. In other words, it is probably one of the only fusions of classical European with classical Islamic. It's a European Muslim art style. We all know about maybe Moorish art. You might have even heard of things like Mamluk art, Fatimid art, in terms of Islamic art. But you've probably never heard of this. So it's another example of this heritage that lies out there that we know almost nothing about. And then we have a coffee seller. Now he's actually he's selling coffee in a town called Novi Pazar in Serbia. Before I went to this place, I didn't even know Serbians could be Muslim. I mean, I know they could convert, but I didn't know there were Serbian Muslims. And so when I arrived in this place, we arrived late in the evening, and as you can imagine, children were hungry. And as you can imagine, being children, they wanted pizza. So we went looking for pizza. We'd seen lots of minarets on the way in, and we assumed, this would be a good place to grab some food. We sat down, and the pizza sign said sausage on the pizza. And of course, to us, sausage means pork. So I went and asked the guy at the window, brother, is the sausage pork? Is it halal? He laughed at me. He said, brother, don't you realize the whole town is Muslim? Serbia. There are entire towns that are Muslim in Serbia, and we knew nothing about it. But the reason I've got the coffee seller up there is because it's also one of the places where they were harboring a beautiful tradition. Not this particular coffee seller, but another one. When I went to buy my coffee, refused my payment. He wouldn't take my payment. Now, I'm a very well-traveled individual, as you can imagine. It's my job. I thought, okay, fair enough, I'll pull up some more notes. You obviously want to rip me off. This is just what happens on the road. It's part and parcel of traveling. All your parents know this if you don't. Okay, we always talk about how badly we got ripped off. So I kept putting notes into his hands, and he kept refusing. And then he said to me, Musafir. And then he put his hands up. Anyone want to take a guess? I like this, man. This is the kind of student I like. Yes? It was for free, but why? You know what Musafir means? I was Musafir. And then why did he put his hands up? The traveler's dua. He was referring to that beautiful hadith where we are told that Allah accepts the dua of free without condition. And one of them is the dua of the Musafir. He valued my dua more than he valued the business. It wasn't this particular gentleman, because I will be very candid with you. I was on the verge of tears. I was not thinking about Instagram. But this was just to show you that this beautiful tradition, and it's a tradition that the Ottomans observed as well, as many imperial Muslim rulers did as well, because you may have heard of the term caravanserai. A caravanserai was basically the equivalent of a trading holiday inn, where traders could stay for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Sultan paid for their bill. Because in our tradition, to look after the Musafir is one of the greatest honors that you can do. And across many Muslim countries to this day, if a traveler turns up for 3 days and 3 nights, They will not let them pay for anything. So it almost blew my mind. It did blow my mind, actually. It certainly left me shocked and stunned that not only did I find Muslims in Serbia, I found an entire Muslim town, and then I found a town that was harboring one of the most beautiful ancient Islamic traditions. That's how little we know about all of this. And then I'm going to end my tour through the Balkans, at least, in front of this place. You see, this is another town in Serbia called Niš. It's just up the road from Novi Pazar, but this is a very different place. Less than 1% of the population here are Muslim according to the census. So I knew it would be difficult, but I had Evliya Çelebi with me, and I was reading his description, and I knew that once upon a time the place was full of Muslims. In fact, I even saw a medieval picture by a pilgrim who had sketched the place, and it had minarets like it was a bed of needles. So I knew there was Islamic heritage there. And what I did was I downloaded a local app. App has since disappeared, nothing to do with me, by the way. And I followed the app because the app was about the Turkish occupation. That's what they call the Ottoman period, and I can relate. And the Serbian resistance. So I thought, this is great. This is going to show me some of the Turkish heritage, and it did. I went to the original Turkish gates. I went to the original Turkish arsenal, not those at the top of the league, but where they keep the guns. And then I went to this place. And when I got here, it suddenly got very frustrating because the app refused to tell me why it had brought me here. It would not tell me why it had brought me on a trail to a Jewish synagogue. I mean, all synagogues are Jewish, but you see the point. It refused to tell me that. It would not explain that. But I knew, because obviously I do my research, I read my history. I knew why it had brought me there, but the app wasn't telling me. Because of course, in telling me why it brought me there, it would have to admit that the Ottomans had done something amazingly positive. You see, that is a Sephardic synagogue. Does anybody know what it means when we say Sephardic? Maybe the gentlemen over there who are constantly talking. Young man, do you know what Sephardic means? No. All right, maybe you should shut up then. Okay, because I've tried to tolerate it, but it's getting really bad. And I can't actually look at my notes because you lot are just nattering. Sephardic means of Spain. So what is a Spanish synagogue doing in Serbia? I'll tell you what it's doing there. You see, the reason Spain has no Muslim heritage is the same reason it has no Jewish heritage. All of us were kicked out. And when the Catholic monarchs kicked the Jews out of Spain, Sultan Bayezid, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II, sent his entire naval fleet to pick up these refugees and give them a new home. So the reason Sephardic Judaism continued in Europe was because the Ottoman sultans gave them homes across the Balkans. Of course, they're now empty because of something horrific that happened later. I stood there feeling quite angry and frustrated that it refused to tell me this. And then I had this moment when I realized that between the Ottoman period and the Umayyad period, as in the Spanish period, for 12 centuries, our European Muslim forefathers stood side by side with the most marginalized, most discriminated religious group in Europe. That's something we should be extremely proud of. Unfortunately, we're often just taught the history of Jews in Europe from the darker side. In other words, what happened in mostly Christian lands. And this, again, is our heritage that we know nothing about. I came away feeling proud of my European Jewish heritage as a Muslim. I no longer felt guilty about stuff that I had nothing to do with. I felt proud that the sultans of Ottomans and the Umayyads did this amazing thing. Now you just told me I've got 5 minutes and I just got to Britain. Okay, I'm going to sprint through this. Okay, anyone know what that is? It's a gold coin. Have a read. It says Offa Rex in the middle. If anyone studied Latin, that means King Offa. This is a coin that was minted in the 8th century by an Anglo-Saxon king. That means an English king in the 8th century. That's a century after Islam was announced. In this country, by the Anglo-Saxon king Offa of Mercia, with the declaration of faith, the Shahada on it, and his own name. Why? Why is one of the first kings of England minting a gold coin with the Islamic Shahada on it? Well, actually, we don't know. But it's not important in many ways. course, it'd be great if we found out that he somehow accepted Islam all those years ago, but it's not important. What is important is that this categorically makes clear that Islam was in this country 12 centuries ago. 12 centuries. Not when your dad came, not when your granddad came, 12 centuries ago. There's a lot of work to do, but I've been doing some work, and I'm going to bring you a bit closer to today. I created 2 heritage trails so that people like you and the mosque can take you to do these trails so you can learn your history. They're down in Woking. One of them is called Britain's Muslim Heritage Trail number 1, the Woking Trail, and the other one is called the Muslim Cemetery Walk. The Woking Trail takes you to 3 of the most important sites of Muslim heritage in Britain. The Shah Jahan Mosque right there is like a miniature Taj Mahal. You just want to pick it up and put it on your mantelpiece. It's beautiful. Built in 1889. Interestingly, by someone of Jewish stock, whose picture is over there. Also, you see here the country's first Muslim cemetery. That's the stone that marks it. That was founded in 1884. It's even older than the mosque. And then finally, you also have probably the only known Muslim soldiers' burial ground anywhere in Europe. These 3 spaces are not just the oldest in Britain, they are the oldest in northwestern Europe. And yet it is not a part of your history lessons. It's not a part of your curriculum. It's not even a part of your madrasa lessons, but we'll get to that later when I talk to Munjabay about that. Now, as well as the Woking Trail, which takes you to these 3 places and explains why they're so important, the trail also that I developed takes you to the cemetery because it is the final resting place of some of the most important Brits to the earliest part of that Muslim heritage I just showed you. In fact, when that Muslim heritage was flourishing, it was mainly white people that were Muslim. It was so influential as a mosque, it was known, quote unquote, as the Makkah of Europe. Not literally, metaphorically. In the cemetery lies this particular gentleman. He was Britain's very first Ottoman-endorsed Sheikhul Islam of Britain. We had a Sheikhul Islam of Britain, like a Grand Mufti, like a Qadi, whatever you wish to call it. His name was Abdullah Quilliam. It's also the final resting place of probably the greatest, oh, I've done that the wrong way around, right? Also the final resting place of the greatest translator in English of the Quran, Marmaduke Pictor, who just popped up on the screen. It's also the final resting place of the last Ottoman princess and wife of the last Nizam of Hyderabad. And finally, personal favorite, an actual British descendant of the Prophet ﷺ, Princess Musbah Haider, daughter of the ex-Grand Sharif of Makkah, who is half British and of course half Arab. And that concludes my talk.